This guy literally starved himself into a mummy. And this guy is putting on a glove full of ants. You're in for an interesting video today. I came across a YouTuber last week by the name of Wendigoon, and he recently released a video about a group of religious monks or Buddhists who starved themselves into mummies. He sort of explained how they did that and the religious reasons behind it. And that video got me wondering, what other extreme and strange ascetic practices exist out in the religious world? Today I'm going to share with you some of the most interesting. But before I do so, I just want to thank you, Wendigoon, for the idea. And if you want to check out his channel, link in description below. Two quick notes before I get started. One, asceticism, for those who may not know, is the practice of extreme self-discipline, normally by religious people, where they abstain from worldly pleasures, basically abuse their bodies, and sometimes they do so to the point of death. And the second point I want to make is I do not support extreme asceticism. If it causes your body harm or leads to death even, I do not support that sort of behavior, even if it is within a religious context. I am simply covering these points and laying them out for educational purposes and because it is very interesting to observe what people are willing to do to their physical bodies and to their life if they are extremely convicted with a religious principle. So if anything, this is a warning to people. Be careful what sort of religious leaders and spiritual influences you let into your life. With that being said, let's dive into it. Of course, I need to start with self-mummification and give you a quick, brief introduction to it. Wendigoon's video dives a lot more into depth than I will, so again, if you want to check out that video about self-mummification, go ahead and do so. But self-mummification, in general, is the practice of someone slowly starving themselves to the point that their body is actually able to be preserved for years on end, like a mummy, following death, of course. And this practice was mostly found among a small Buddhist group called Shingon, and I believe they were located in Japan, and they still may be, by what I understand. It's also important to note that this group does not represent Buddhism as a whole. It is an offshoot of Buddhism, and there are a lot of different Buddhist groups that would disagree with some of their practices. But there were many Shingon members who attempted self-mummification, especially during the 11th through 19th century, for religious reasons. Here are the two most important reasons. One, the founder of the Shingon sector of Buddhism died due to starvation, and not because he wasn't able to find enough food to sustain himself, but rather he willingly starved himself to death. Their leader's name was Kukai. I probably am saying that wrong, but there's the spelling on the screen. He also was an extreme ascetic. Near the end of his life, he started to not eat food and abstain from drinking water and, the things that you need to sustain your body because the body was seen as unimportant for the spiritual ascension of the soul. And as Kukai became more and more devout in his religious practices, the more of asceticism he delved into, which then eventually led to him starving himself for the sake of spiritual advancement. And since the Shingon's leader or founder starved himself with ascetic practices and also made it clear that the body is actually very unimportant when it comes to soul advancement, and that asceticism is actually a good practice for someone to spiritually evolve, you can assume that his followers are going to emulate his practices. So Shingon members, following their leader's death, adopted the practice of self-mummification into the spiritual journey. Now, it wasn't required for anyone to mummify themselves. It wasn't a requirement. It was really only a practice for those who were really devout and who thought they would be able to truly reach the pinnacle of their spiritual enlightenment and awakening. And this concept slowly evolved into self-mummification, where if someone was able to starve themselves and then be mummified, it was definitely a sign that they were blessed and that they have spiritually ascended and became basically like Buddha, by what I understand. Was anyone actually ever successful at doing this? The answer is actually yes. There were a handful of people who succeeded at mummifying themselves without any sort of outside involvement. Of course, more people failed attempting this than succeeded, but some did succeed, and this is how one was to accomplish self-mummification. The process normally took about 10 years, although technically it could take less time than that. But generally speaking, it took about 10 years. For about 3-year periods, monks would eat only pine needles, drink water, and forage through the forest for the bare necessities to survive. And they would repeat this process for another 3 years if they didn't think they were sufficiently thin enough or ready enough or spiritually mature enough to move on to the next phase of the self-mummification process. So normally people would spend about 6 years almost starving themselves, eating the bare minimum to keep themselves alive. It's also important to keep in mind that whenever they did this, especially self-mummification or really anything, these monks were constantly chanting, doing meditations and prayers and religious stuff. So it's also important to keep in mind that they weren't just simply doing this for fun and not doing anything else. They were spending a lot of time engaging in their spiritual practices. Now, presuming that the monk or the Shingo member is still alive, many died trying to attempt this diet of just foraging through the woods and eating bark, pine needles, and water, they would then have to spend another 100 days, following the years of starving themselves, to go completely without food. They would drink only like saline water and some specific type of tea called yorushi. And if they were able to do this for 100 days, again, even if people made it to this point, they often starved to death and died at this step of the phase, so a lot of people were being weeded out up to this point, then the monk would be basically buried alive. They would basically be put inside some sort of container and then put underground. They would be in the lotus position doing meditations and chants while being buried alive, and they would be doing that effectively for basically the rest of their time down there until they died. But that was the final step in the process. Then later, the fellow Shingon members or monks would go check on the box to see if the body was decomposing or not. If the body decomposed, again, mission failed. They would be honored for at least attempting the long and rigorous task of mummifying oneself, but they wouldn't have excelled. They wouldn't have reached the pinnacle of their spirituality. But if the body was mummified, they would be honored as someone who has spiritually ascended and has become basically like the Buddha, or at least very close to that point. So yeah, that is basically self-mummification and what this Buddhist group did to spiritually ascend. And again, more details and wording and things like that can be found in Wendigoon's video if you want to check it out. But that is only the beginning, my friends. There are many, many other ascetic practices out there that are also very strange and extreme. Take, for instance, pillar life. Saint Simeon Stylite, around 300 to 400 AD, became notorious within Christian tradition for starting a movement of pillar life. What is pillar life, you ask? Good question. Simeon believed that one withholds from themselves worldly pleasure and practices asceticism and denies their body of comfort, they will better secure their salvation, they will grow closer to God, and gain more spiritual awareness within Christianity specifically. So Simeon endeavored to accomplish this by living on a small pillar for about 37 years of his life. He resided, by what I understand, on 2 pillars, the second one being higher than the first, but neither of them provided him with ample room to stretch out his legs or ever really be comfortable. And living on this pillar, as you could imagine, limited the amount of things he was able to do. Most of what he did with his time was pray and meditate, dwell on scripture, and then also teach the pagan crowds or teach fellow Christians about the Bible, and that's what he spent most of his life doing while he lived on his pillar. He had a ladder available to him so that he would be able to reach out to the crowd if necessary, or to be given food, because obviously he still needs food to live. But in general, he spent most of his time up on top of the pillar. And supposedly, he was a very good teacher. Supposedly, he was very effective at preaching and teaching the masses that gathered around his pillar, because they were very intrigued why this guy was living on a pillar, and supposedly converted a lot of people and inspired a lot of Christians at the time. And following his death, if not even during his life potentially, he inspired other Christians to do the same thing. There's also accounts of other Christians living on pillars and practicing this form of asceticism to emulate what Simeon Stylite had done before them. And this tradition is not really popular anymore, but for a time, it was a little bit among a small group of Christians. Speaking of interesting Christian practices and offshoots, snake handling is the next on this list. Snake handling is a bit of a unique one on this list, but we'll dive into it. It's also probably one of the more recent ones on this list as far as is it being currently practiced or not. There have been a handful of churches throughout the Christian tradition, especially in the West, and as of recent, there might even be some snake handling churches to this day that I'm not aware of. But I know at least during the mid-1900s, late 1900s, there were still churches around. And basically what would happen at a snake handling church is they would have services, special services at least, where they would pull out venomous snakes. And you can already see where this is probably going. The purpose of these services was to prove if someone was a true follower of Christ, and to prove that as Christians they had power over venomous snakes, that they wouldn't be affected by them. Now, their spiritual/scriptural reasons for this goes back to some principles found within the Bible, and specifically a very specific story about Paul. There's a story about Paul in the Bible that after he escaped a boat wreck, a shipwreck, that he ended up getting bitten by a snake, and a poisonous one to be exact. And everyone was freaking out thinking that Paul was going to die. But Paul did not die, and he actually ended up killing the snake, and he was perfectly fine. It was supposed to be a miracle that saved Paul's life, and some churches eventually took this concept that true believers and true Christians would be able to handle venomous snakes and would not suffer the consequences. So, of course, if a poisonous snake did end up killing you or harming you or in any sort of way, that would be proof to them that either A, you lacked faith, you weren't a Christian. It was definitely not good for where you stood with God and with Christ. And supposedly, if the poison snake did not harm you or, affect you in any way that was significant, your faith was strong and you were secure as a Christian. I think most of these churches are pretty much non-existent because, for the most part, this wasn't really, this was kind of frowned upon by governments and by police force and things like that. So I don't know how prominent it is anymore, but it used to be around for a time. Self-immolation. Now, I think it's important to note that self-immolation is often not a religious practice as much as it is a practice of protest by religious groups, and the most common one being the Buddhist monk out in Vietnam. And before I jump into that story, self-immolation, for those who may not know, is basically lighting yourself on fire, and again, generally for reasons of protest. But there was a famous account of this happening during the 1960s in Vietnam when a monk lit himself on fire. And you can see his name here, and if I have a picture, I'll show you that as well. And the reason why he lit himself on fire was because he was protesting the persecution of Buddhists within Vietnam, specifically at the hands of the United States government. I'm only mentioning this one briefly because it's not necessarily a religious practice as much as a way that people see that they can express themselves in a political manner. But I thought it'd at least be worth mentioning. The Akipa ceremony. Now this one is fascinating. The Akipa ceremony was a common Native American practice by a specific group of natives, specifically the Mandan people of North Dakota. The ceremony was a 4-day event that was supposed to give a recount of creation and their understanding of how things came to be. And the ceremony incorporated a lot of different elements. There would be, dancing, there would be acting, there would be dressing up. People would dress up as buffaloes, people would dress up as holy women, people would dress up as eagles. There's a lot of things going on here. But what's important to note is that during this time, it was also common for men to do some extreme bodily harm and practice ascetic practices. There were some who would spend their time meditating, fasting, and trying to get spiritual revelations and visions and stuff like that. However, the younger men, generally speaking, would want to prove their bravery to their tribe. And they would do this through multiple means of pain and harm to themselves. They would be pierced by wooden skewers, they would get cuts and lashes in their body, they would be hung from ceilings or from high places with rope to their body. It wasn't pleasant by any means. It was supposed to be very painful. And I'm just going to read to you from a direct source, and you can get an idea here of what they went through. The younger men generally underwent torture to demonstrate their bravery. Long wooden skewers were pushed through the cuts in their skin on their backs or chests, and they were hung by ropes from beams. Their bodies were weighed down with buffalo skulls hung from other skewers that thrust into their thighs and calves. The torment was extreme, but crying out was a sign of cowardice, and those best able to stand the pain became Mandan leaders. Women were not allowed inside the lodge, although some would sit on the roof where they would fast. And then it jumps into other stuff. So you get the idea. Extreme pain. Don't cry. Don't show any sort of cowardice. And if so, you may just become a leader. And the next ascetic practice falls into a very similar vein as this one. There is a tribe in Amazon, but I understand to this day, that has a coming of age practice for men that is also very intense. this coming of age tradition that I'm about to talk about doesn't involve skewering people or hanging them from ceilings. It's not quite that extreme, I guess. Although, I don't even know if this is much better. There's a very specific type of ant. This might seem like a very interesting jump from what I just talked about, but I'll pull it all together here soon. There's a very specific type of ant called the bullet ant that has a sting that is considered about 30 times more painful than a bee sting, an average bee sting. And as far as insects go, it's considered one of the most painful experiences you can have from a bug. I mean, the very reason why these ants have the name they have is because it feels like you got shot by a bullet when you get stung by one of them. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever been shot before, but it's not pleasant. So how does this tie back to the tribe I was just talking about moments ago? Well, you see, this tribe, for their coming of age event, for a young man to prove that he is a warrior type, to prove that he's brave, to prove that he would defend and fight for his tribe, and he's ready to take on the harsh jungle that they live in, he must participate in a tradition of putting on a glove full of angry bullet ants. Perhaps if he did this one time, it wouldn't be nearly as bad, but this process must be repeated 20 times. And each time he puts them on, it's a 10-minute interval. He doesn't have to do these all in one day. He can do these over the course of several months or a few years, depending on who he is or, you know, how willing he is to become a brave warrior type. But to give you an idea of how painful these 10 minutes would be for the person, again, imagine several bullet shots going through your hand. Not fun. Secondly, these bullet ants have neurotoxins in their bite that can last upwards to 24 hours, invoking side effects such as muscle paralysis, hallucinations, burning sensations, and just general fatigue and pain. And after about 24 hours of this, eventually the pain starts dying down and the side effects start wearing off. And the whole religious/cultural purpose for this is to prove to the young man that life is full of pain and sorrow and struggle. And since boys generally don't experience too much pain or struggle growing up, to become a man, you must be introduced to this concept. And it's not that you just have to be introduced to it, you have to be able to overcome it and prove that you're willing to face it. And that's why if you want to become a warrior or like be seen as a man within the tribe, you need to prove your bravery by doing this. So yeah, bullet ant gloves. Never knew that was a thing until I did this video, but now I know. And now you know too. But in conclusion, my friends, be careful what religious influences you let speak into your life, and always be cautious of the aesthetic practices that people try to push onto you. With that being said, comment down below what sort of aesthetic practices have I left out in this video that you find interesting, or what are just other religious practices in general that stand out to you as unique. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And friends, as always, go out there and light the world yourselves.